Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Kelly. I'm going to talk a little bit today, first of all, about Brexit. This is because I know all of you want to hear a bit more about what's going on in Britain after Brexit. It's also very useful for me because it gives me an opportunity to say a lot of good messages about Britain. Brexit, one of the silver linings of Brexit has been that I've been invited to speak right across the southeast about the issue. So I was in Charlotte in North Carolina last week doing that. I'm going to be in Savannah later this week. I'm going to be in Chattanooga. I'm going to be in Spartanburg, talking about Brexit everywhere. So if you want to get your country on everybody's radar screens, get them to vote to do something like Brexit, and everyone will invite you around. After Brexit, I'm going to talk about a couple of areas of policy initiative in Britain, which I think may be of interest to people in Georgia, about education and about public-private partnerships, or P3. And then I think there's an opportunity for some questions, but if the difficult questions I was asked by people on my table over lunch or anything to go by, I should probably stall my talk and take up all the time for questions, because I think they're going to be really tough from you guys who are clearly very well versed in asking difficult questions. So, Brexit. Now, I'm sure that, like me, most of you were quite surprised by the IT not working. So, up arrow?
It should.
Okay, that's good. By the Brexit result. In many ways we shouldn't have been, because the opinion polls the week before were telling us quite clearly that Leave was ahead, but I think that the feeling after the murder of the Labour MP Jo Cox was that perhaps some of the passions that had been ignited by the debate would have cooled down, and indeed the exit polls showed that there was going to be a small majority for Remain. But the outcome was 52% voted to leave the European Union. A really high turnout, much higher than we have in general elections. The only election that came anywhere near that high turnout was the Scottish independence referendum 18 months earlier. And of course, immediately after that vote, there was a lot of feeling of shock across the United Kingdom, across Europe, and indeed across the world. A lot of uncertainty too. But when I'm asked about this uncertainty, I say it's a little bit like a funnel. So the day after the Brexit vote, we were probably at the widest point of that funnel. There was a huge amount of uncertainty. We didn't know who was going to be Prime Minister after David Cameron had stood down. We didn't know who was going to be the government, what we were going to do. But very quickly, the British political system showed its resilience, resilience of a system that's been around for sort of hundreds of years. And within 2.5 weeks, we had a new leader of the Conservative Party and a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, who everybody that observes British politics is pretty clear is the best choice to be Prime Minister at this time. She has a long background in Conservative politics. She was a former chair of the Conservative Party, and she's been our Home Secretary, our Domestic Security Minister, for 6 years. And that's one of the toughest briefs in British politics. Most political commentators describe being Home Secretary as the graveyard of political careers. So to last 6 years, which is almost a record, means you must be pretty tough. So she took over, she appointed a new government. She created new British government ministries focusing on Brexit. So there is a new Department for Exiting the European Union, or Ministry for Brexit, which sole purpose is to negotiate Britain's exit from the European Union. And she also created a new Department for International Trade, whose purpose is to look around the world and see how Britain can take advantage of Brexit by signing new free trade agreements around the world. Now, I think there was a fear among some people that when Britain voted for Brexit, that this was Britain turning its back on the world, Britain turning its back on free trade. That is wrong. The British government has made it very clear that Britain is not going to be turning its back on the world. Quite the contrary, that with Brexit, Britain is going to become more global. And in fact, our whole narrative that civil servants, diplomats such as me are told to go forth and tell people about, is that we're now focused on global Britain, Britain as a bigger operator in the world as a result of Brexit, not a little Britain, not a Britain that's turning its back on the world. And the other thing is that it's very clear that from the top, from the Prime Minister, from the government, that Brexit means Brexit. There had been some discussion among people that, oh, can we have another referendum? Maybe Parliament could vote against it, maybe we could stay after all. But you can't do that. If you're in a democracy like Britain, like the United States, if you have a referendum on a really big existential question like that, and the people, despite the government's effort campaigning against it, say, we want to leave the European Union, you cannot overturn that. Even though it's got no legal binding side to it, you cannot overturn a referendum like that. So Brexit means Brexit. Britain is going to leave the European Union. If you did try and ignore that, it would only breed greater cynicism in politics as normal. And in many ways, Brexit was a warning to politicians that people are unhappy with politics as normal. People are still unhappy after the financial crisis. People are still unhappy about some of the downsides of globalisation. So the new government is clear that Brexit means Brexit, and that as it goes forward as global Britain, it will also make sure that it carries all of its citizens with it. And the Prime Minister, on her speech on the steps of number 10 Downing Street, reminded everybody that the Conservative Party's full title is the Conservative and Unionist Party, and that means that she wants to unify the whole country, not two nations, one nation, and bring all of the different countries of the United Kingdom with her in this journey that Britain has embarked upon. So, those key stakeholders for moving forward on Brexit, they are, of course, as I just mentioned, the nations of Britain, so Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, as well as England and the regions and cities of England and Wales. Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain, but as they are part of the United Kingdom, the whole overall vote was to leave. So they will be leaving with the rest of the country. But because of that desire to stay with Europe, their views need to be taken into account as the British government works out its position on a future relationship with Europe. And that will probably mean that we will remain more in the single market than perhaps some people who voted for leave would like, and that Scotland and Northern Ireland in particular will be given some special status that allows them to remain maybe in some cultural aspects of the European Union as well. The other key stakeholders are the different parts of the British industry. This slide here shows a skyline of the City of London. That is a very big stakeholder. The financial sector in Britain is the world's biggest international financial system. London is the world's biggest international financial capital. It's in terms of its size, it's about the same size as New York, but it's much more internationally trading in London. And most of the banks and the security exchanges in London want to still be able to have full access to the European Union's financial services market. And I put auto sector there because the British auto sector has been incredibly successful over the last 15 years. When I was growing up, British cars were absolutely rubbish. I remember doing a university exchange in the US. You never saw a British car here, they were terrible. British cars are now among the world's best. We have some great brands in Jaguar Land Rover, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, and they're all at the upper end, so they are in the sweet spot for the global economy. They haven't become commoditized, there's big value added in those cars. So those auto manufacturers still want access to that single market. They don't want tariffs on their cars, they don't want paperwork, they want to just be able to export those. So all these stakeholders will be consulted over this period of the summer. Sometime in the early fall, September, maybe by the Conservative Party conference in early October, the Prime Minister will then articulate what sort of a future relationship Britain wants with the European Union. We don't know for sure, lots of guesses out there, but most commentators seem to suggest that we will look for a future relationship that keeps Britain in the single market like Norway and Switzerland are, but which gives Britain some leverage, some control over some aspects of migration. Where that exactly will come out will be subject to the negotiations. The actual process for leaving the European Union, there is a legal process for doing that, and Britain will have to at some stage invoke what's known as Article 50 of the EU treaties. And once that article has been triggered, there's then a 2-year time frame for negotiating the exit, and in parallel negotiating the agreement for Britain's future relationship with the European Union. Nobody knows exactly when the Prime Minister will trigger that article. However, the indications seem to be that she won't do that until the new year. She might even wait a bit longer into next year until she's absolutely sure that she's clear about what future relationship Britain wants. She's clear that all stakeholders are happy, and that maybe some inconvenient elections in Europe are out of the way, like the French presidential elections, but that's up to her to decide. Once that triggered, Britain will be on a one-way track, and somewhere around 2.5 to 3 years' time, Britain will be completely out of the European Union, but will have some future relationship with Europe, probably in the single market. Now, in some ways, the timing for Brexit is quite good for Britain. The British economy has been doing very well. Britain's economy has been one of the fastest growing in the G8 over the last 3 to 4 years. We have created, for example, 2 million jobs in the last 5 years under the Conservative and coalition governments. We were the second fastest growing economy last year in the G7. And even with Brexit, the IMF, which has been on the more pessimistic end of the people over the economic impact of Brexit, even after Brexit, the IMF's prediction for growth next year shows Britain growing faster than either Germany or France or Italy of the European economies. So the British economy is pretty resilient. And I think that was displayed in the immediate aftermath of the vote. The Bank of England has done an incredibly good job of recapitalising the banking system, making sure there are huge buffers there. There's been an overhaul of the regulation system for the banks. The budget deficit has been heavily reduced over the last 6 years. And the economy has shown how robust it is. In that even with the shock of Brexit, the data that's coming out at the moment seems to show that the economy won't be affected very badly at all in the next few months. For example, the budget deficit for July, the month after Brexit, actually showed a surplus, which surprised all economists. So that shows that there's still healthy economic activity going on. There is still more money coming into the exchequer through that economic activity. So as a result of that, Britain is in a good place to weather Brexit and to take advantage going forward of all the positive things that will come out of being outside of the European Union. And there are some big positives from it. There is the opportunity to strike these free trade agreements around the world. The European Union was good at doing free trade agreements. It had a lot of weight, it had a lot of leverage because of that. But because who we had those agreements with and what was in them was decided by 28 countries, of which Britain was just one voice, they were not often in the right places for us in Britain. For example, we had in the European Union, we have a free trade agreement with Central America. We have one with the Caribbean. Now that's really nice, but they're not big markets for Britain. We don't have a free trade agreement with India. We don't have a free trade agreement with Australia, for example. Those are big and important markets for Britain. So after Brexit, we will be able to strike those free trade agreements with those important markets for Britain. And we'll also be able to include in them elements that we would like to have in them. So frequently agriculture was taken out of agreements or was limited because some of our European partners have really big agricultural vested interests. We have some good farms in Britain, but the GDP contribution of farming to Britain is less than Formula One contributes to the British economy, so we don't have quite the same need for agricultural exclusion from these agreements. And things like entertainment and creative industries. Britain has, after the United States, one of the biggest and most vibrant film industries in the world. We're happy to be in a competitive market for that, so we wouldn't exclude those from trade deals if we were left, as we will be, to our own devices on those. Then we will be able to also avoid some of the regulation that's come from Europe in the future to make the British economy even more flexible, even more competitive, and we come near the top of most of the ease of doing business leagues, but we'll be even further up those. And we'll have a bit more control over varying our VAT, our sales tax, which at the moment under Europe we can't vary our sales tax, so that's something that we only put it up, we can't bring it down. So that's something that gives us more flexibility going forward. So that's enough on Brexit, but I'm happy to take those difficult questions if there's time. Now on to policy making. Needless to say, the British political system is very different from the US. We have far less politically appointed people. Traditionally, policy in theory under the classical theory of British constitution is that civil servants like myself are non-political and we give ministers advice on the best policies. Now in the real world, and certainly for the last 45, 50 years, that's not really how policy has been made in Britain. We have many think tanks, very good ones, some stretching right back to the post-war years like the IEA, but many, many more who are, and there's many of them created all the time, who come up with really good policy ideas. They influence governments while they're in opposition. governments have special advisors who are politically appointed people who come and advise ministers on policy, and they bring those ideas into government. So a lot of policy does come from outside government. But Britain also looks internationally a lot for our policy advice. Britain, as many of you will know, had a terrible 30-odd years after World War II. We were in economic decline for 30 years. Many people refer to us as the sick man of Europe by the 1970s. As a result, our feeling that everything made in Britain was best, everything about the British political system was best, we disappeared, and we started to look increasingly internationally for ideas. And in some ways it goes back to Britain at the beginning of our takeoff as a great power. If you go back to the early 1700s, we took a lot of ideas from across the Channel. So we took the idea of an independent central bank and a stock exchange from the Dutch. I suppose we took democracy from you guys, but we wouldn't like to admit that. So we have in the past looked internationally for ideas, but I think at the height of our power in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we were probably quite complacent. With our post-war economic decline and then the rebound, where we were the fastest growing economy in the G8 for 25 years, has meant that we do look hugely internationally. And we also tend to look at those countries that are more like us. So we look a lot at Scandinavia, we look at Canada, we look at Australia and New Zealand. And although it's not on this map, we do look at the United States. In fact, many people many British politicians, tend to look at the United States almost as 50 different political laboratories, so 50 states. You experiment with policy ideas. For example, Georgia, you mentioned here the great things you're doing on penal reform and judicial reform. Those sort of things are looked at by British politicians. They hear about them. They're well networked. Many of our politicians have lived in the United States. They go to conventions here on both sides of the political divide, and they follow these policy ideas, and they come and look at what's going on policy-wise. So we do a lot of work on stealing ideas from overseas. Let me just go and tell you a little about a couple of areas of policy development in Britain. One of those I want to talk about is public-private partnerships. Now, you have those in Georgia. You've had fairly recent new legislation, I think, passed the year before, to give a lot more opportunity for public-private partnership. Again, this is something that we've been doing in Britain for about 25 years. Again, we didn't invent it, but we stole the idea from elsewhere. I think actually the Spanish had done some interesting P3 earlier on infrastructure. But we took this idea and we've tried it in lots of different areas. It's been a great success, and it's got political buy-in from all three of our major political parties. The Conservative Party in the 1990s started with P3. They used it for roads and for some rail. And then the Labour Party that came in 1997 used P3 and particularly took it off to use it for schools and hospitals and other bits of social infrastructure. And then it would continue under the coalition government, so the Liberal Democratic Party was also fully bought into that. So we've had 25 years of experience, we've had bipartisan support. We've obviously made a lot of mistakes in that time. For example, my foreign service has a very expensive embassy in Berlin, where we didn't sign the contracts, so we didn't get the best lawyers in to do the contracts, so we can't use some of the facilities because they'd be too expensive. But we've learnt from those mistakes, and we now have, today in our model, we get the private sector to do a lot of the work. So a typical public-private partnership today in Britain, the private sector will design the piece of infrastructure, they will build it, they will finance it as well, and they will maintain that infrastructure as well. And they'll typically do it from a 20 to 30 year time frame, so a very long time frame. And then at the end of that period, that piece of infrastructure will be given to the public sector. So the reason we do that is that from that 25 years experience, we wanted to make sure that as much risk as possible was transferred to the private sector. And we also recognised that if you didn't get the private sector to finance it and to maintain it, they would not build the best quality infrastructure. When we used to do the classic public sector infrastructure, where the British government would give a contract, the private sector would get it, they would build a piece of infrastructure pretty cheaply, we would run it for about 10 or 15 years and it would start to fall down, then we'd have to rebuild it again. Using the public-private partnership route, The private sector, first of all, builds a much better piece of infrastructure. It builds in quality, so it will last that 20, 30-year time frame, because they've got to maintain it. They want to minimise the bills. They also know that under the contracts we now sign that they won't get paid until it's ready, so they tend to make sure it's built on time. And they also know that the moment something doesn't work, if it's a school, if the roof starts leaking, or if it's a road and it develops potholes, the government will stop paying the monthly charge, and we won't pay it until it's put right, and we won't be any backdated payment either. So there's a big incentive to make sure that that piece of infrastructure is maintained well as well. And then because the private sector also finance it, and that's typically done by the banks are on the back of the contractors all the time, because they don't want their payments missed. They want to make sure they're getting that steady return for the public-private infrastructure. So it's been a big success in Britain. We use it for horizontal infrastructure, as you call it here, so we do it for roads, we do it for bridges. Like Georgia, we sometimes have the problem of British people not wanting to pay tolls for roads and bridges, so we actually use shadow tolling for that. So that's if people are really resistant to paying a toll for a bridge, the government will actually pay a shadow toll depending on the number of vehicles that use it, so that can be built into contracts. We've used it for our high-speed 1 rail link that goes from London to the Channel Tunnel, and we're using it for our new high-speed 2 rail link that goes from London up to the north of England. We've used it to maintain the London Underground system, which is one of the world's most comprehensive and complex underground railways. And we've used it to build the new Crossrail link, which goes from east to west across London. And then we also use it for vertical infrastructure. So I mentioned schools, we also use it for hospitals, and we use it for offices. And today Britain has over £54 billion worth of infrastructure under P3 projects. I used to know how much that was in dollars, but because the pound is not very strong at the moment, it's probably only about $70 billion, it would have been more. But also on P3, we realise that it's not always the best fit for all types of infrastructure. So the way we finance infrastructure is a mix. Some of it is purely private, some of it is done under the traditional public sector route, and about a third of it is done under P3. We've also have another interesting route for funding infrastructure is that we set out a route that allows sovereign wealth funds and big private pension funds from overseas to fund British infrastructure, and do it in such a way that provides a low risk, steady rate of return for those investments. So one of the biggest investors in British infrastructure at the moment is actually the Canadian State Pension Fund. So that's a good way of getting money out for Canadians for infrastructure. So that's enough on P3. I'm happy to take some questions on that. But I'm just going to move on to say a little bit about education. You obviously heard about education reform in 1997 from the member from the British Council. That was nearly 20 years ago, and education reform has moved on in Britain, but some of those principles remain the same. So in education in Britain, this is now devolved to the different nations. So I'm talking about education reform in England alone. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have all gone their own path. But actually that's quite an interesting experiment, because England has been the more radical in education, and the results of these education reforms are beginning to show in league tables where England is moving up ahead of bits of the United Kingdom that traditionally were actually better at education. So Scotland and Northern Ireland always used to be at the top of the league tables, but they are faltering, and England is catching up and overhauling on education in terms of standards. Now the main route we have gone down is what we call academies or free schools, and those are very similar to your charter schools. So as the British Council expert said in 1997, this has been a process of devolving power from local government to the individual schools, giving power to the heads of those schools and to the boards of governors of those schools. And this was started in 1997. It was given some limited rollout by the New Labour government. Those of you who may have followed the New Labour government, it was quite a divided government between Tony Blair and his finance minister, and the Tony Blair wing of the Labour Party was very keen to push this, but it didn't get as far as perhaps they would have liked. But the coalition government that came in 2010, the Conservative Liberal government, took the academies and really pushed them and introduced a new Education Act that actually took them from being just a type of reform that focused on failing schools in inner cities but took them to the majority of schools in England. And the Act allowed the government to incentivise schools to move from being under local authority control to becoming self-governing academies. And just over half of all the schools in England now are self-governing academies. And there was some financial incentive to do that, because the government reckoned that putting the money through local authorities, because a lot of it came from the Centre for Education, and then onto the schools, the local authorities skimmed some of that money off. So they accounted for maybe 10% for bureaucratic skim, and would then give the schools an additional percentage to make up for that bureaucratic skim. So there was a clear incentive for schools to do that. But there was also just the incentive of having the power to set your own agenda, to hire and fire teachers, to team up with sponsors from the private sector, and to specialise. So if you felt that your school was pretty good at music, you could focus more on music and become a more music-orientated one. If you were very good at sciences, you could specialise in sciences. You could get maybe some sponsorship from big pharmaceutical companies, or from engineering companies if you wanted to go down the engineering route. And that's the route that a lot of schools have gone down. Because there was always a danger in this model that the best schools, and because the funding is done by pupils, the best schools would want to, particularly in the middle class suburban areas, would want to exclude less advantaged pupils. One of the things the coalition government did is they introduced a pupil premium, and this is an idea that actually came from the Liberal Democrats, but basically schools will get more funding for each pupil that comes from a deprived background, and that's defined by whether they get subsidised school dinners. And that's been a very successful part of the reform. It's meant that the new academies and new free schools, as they developed, have made sure that they have taken a wide, diverse range of pupils, not just those from middle-class backgrounds who tend to do better because they've got that strong parental input, but they've also taken kids from right across the social scales, and that's really shown up. They've also introduced an idea that they've got from Sweden, which is they've allowed groups of parents who are in a school area, if they feel that none of the schools in their area are actually good enough, and that they want to club together and form a new school with a not-for-profit education provider, the government will fund that, and they will give them the funding on a per-pupil basis to start that new school. And although not very many of those new schools have started, I think there's only about 15 or 20, the very fact that that is there as a competitive spur is a very powerful instrument, and does mean that also that parents feel they've got a new sort of tool in their toolbox to use if they're in an area where they're dissatisfied with the level of education. So that has been, again, a very successful idea taken from the Swedes. And finally, the coalition government also made progress on moving teacher pay away from being determined by time serving and much more focused on performance, which is obviously a very important part of improving education. Obviously a very controversial one, and it took a lot of work with the teaching unions to do that, but it has been now the way they move forward on that. So that's what's been going on in education. I couldn't resist it, but I thought I'd say a little bit about the Olympics, because 20 years ago, I think you had the Olympics in this city. The reason I say that in such a quizzical way is because it was the worst ever Olympics that Britain ever participated in. Not in terms of the way you ran it brilliantly, but we only got one gold medal. It was the worst performance by a British Olympic team to any Olympics. So most British people have tried to forget the Atlanta Olympics. And yet here we are, 20 years later. We've had our best Olympics for 100 years. We came second after the United States. We beat the Chinese, which is pretty impressive given that we have 5% of their population. And we got 27 golds. So that's from 1 to 27 in 20 years. So what has happened? Have we suddenly got really fit as a nation? Have we suddenly got somebody sort of zapped us with superpowers? No, again, it's reformed by government. And the British Prime Minister in 1996 was John Major, Conservative Prime Minister, a great follower of British sport. He was incredibly upset by Britain's dismal performance. So he went straight back to the UK and worked very much with to develop a new system for promoting sport in Britain. And he came up with a new agency called UK Sport, which was launched in May 1997, and which was funded, or is an organisation that funds sport and channels lottery money from the National Lottery into sport, as well as government money. And it's learnt from looking at what other countries do. Again, it's learnt from the United States. It's learnt particularly from countries like Australia, which again is a sporting superpower for its size. And it's been very clever in concentrating on the sports where there is a high payback from your investments. They've done it's a very market-driven approach. It's quite ruthless. If we think that we can get a high payback in terms of goals and medal success, we will put more money into that. And that's both the numbers and looking at the competition. So it's ruthlessly targeted at its funds, and has led to a steady improvement in Britain's position in the medals league table. So we were second in Rio, we were third in London, I think we were fourth in the one before that, which means next year we're going to beat you. And we're going to be first, next Olympics. So I'm going to stop on that high note, and I'm happy to take those really difficult questions from you. So thank you very much indeed.